Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started with our webinar. My name is Anthony Bowman. I'm the Community Partners Network Manager with Advancing Justice AAJC, and I'm joined here today with our presenter, Purna Lal, one of our staff attorneys for immigration and immigrant rights. Today is part one of our summer webinar series on immigration enforcement. Immigration enforcement is a complicated issue, but it's something that we should all care about because it impacts our civil and human rights. We hope that by providing more background, have a second speaker, Stephanie Kamba, who is an undocumented queer Filipina poet who has worked on a number of immigrant rights related campaigns and projects. However, Stephanie had a last-minute conflict and will not be able to join us today as planned. She sends her regrets. Purna will present for approximately 30 to 40 minutes. After Purna's presentation, we will have time for Q&A. We will use the question features on the webinar to get questions from participants. Because so many of you have joined today, all participants will be kept on mute for the duration of the webinar to minimize interference and background noise. A couple of final notes. First, we are recording this webinar and we'll post it online afterwards for your reference. And lastly, the information presented today is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. And now, without any further delay, I will turn it over to Purna for our presentation.
Thank you, Anthony. So basically, first we'll go over who enforces our immigration laws. We'll also talk about what enforcement looks like. And then we'll talk about enforcement against U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents. And we'll go into specific immigration enforcement programs that are currently in place. And finally, we'll discuss with you why this is an API issue. So let's get started with who enforces our immigration laws. There are many different parts of the federal government that carry out immigration enforcement. But for our purpose today, the main one is the Department of Homeland Security, also known as DHS. DHS actually used to be called INS, which is the Immigration Naturalization Service. But the INS is no more. After the attacks of September 11, 2001, the U.S. government split the functions of the INS into two different agencies, the Department of Justice, which now houses our immigration court system, and the Department of Homeland Security. So let's take a deeper dive into the different components of the Department of Homeland Security, which is DHS. The first part of DHS, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, also known as USCIS, is an agency that mainly decides applications for immigration status, such as green cards, work permits, citizenship applications, and so on. The second part is, people much more familiar with this, is the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also ICE. ICE is the primary agency tasked with enforcing immigration laws within the U.S. As an agency, it runs dozens of enforcement programs and facilities to further the detection and detention and deportation of non-citizens or immigrants from the U.S. It is also one of the largest enforcement agencies in the country, currently with an $18 billion budget. Finally, the third and final component of DHS is Customs and Border Protection, or CBP. CBP is primarily responsible for regulating immigration and trade at the border and ports of entry, including at airports across the country. The agency also enforces immigration laws within 100 miles of the U.S. border by setting up immigration checkpoints, and we'll talk more about this later on during specific programs. Also want to touch briefly on how the removal process typically occurs. By removal, I also mean deportation, as they are used interchangeably in everyday conversation. But basically, a removal is the actual judicial process through which someone is deported, and we'll talk about how that happens. Basically, any of the three components of DHS, whether ICE or CBP or USCIS, when they locate or find a person who's allegedly in violation of immigration laws, either by overstaying a visa or they have committed a crime, they refer that person to immigration court. So an individual is either detained or not detained typically, depending on whether they are a flight risk or danger to the community. And if caught at the border, if CBP catches someone at the border, the individual is typically reported without any sort of trial or seeing a judge, which is called an expedited removal or return. If someone is just caught within the parameters of what is called interior enforcement or caught not at the border, they're sent a notice to appear for proceedings in immigration court before an immigration judge, which can take many, many years. So that's just how it looks. So what does immigration enforcement, entail? Basically, one of the examples of immigration enforcement is a denial of an immigrant visa or a green card. Denial can occur abroad by a consular officer, which is or a consular office, or in the U.S. through the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. So just a case example of an example of an enforcement action is this case is actually from one of our affiliates, the Asian Law Caucus. It actually went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Basically, this is Fawzia Din, a U.S. citizen who applied for a green card for her husband, Kanishk Berashk, in 2006. Her husband used to be a payroll clerk in the government of Afghanistan when the Taliban was in power, though he himself had no ties to terrorism. Nonetheless, her visa application for her husband was pending for many, many years and then denied based on national security reasons. And that's the only reason that the government had to give, according to the Supreme Court. So she has been living apart from her spouse for the past 10 years now, and that is an immigration enforcement action. The next enforcement action actually is a case example from my own case. That's a little cartoon that my friend drew for me. So my grandmother had petitioned for my parents when I was a child. Because we have these really long visa backlogs, by the time my parents could get a green card, I was over the age of 21. So they received their green cards, but the USCIS placed me in proceedings for basically growing older. So long story short, I was in proceedings for about 3 years of law school until the U.S. Supreme Court struck down DOMA, which is the Defense of Marriage Act, and allowed me to marry my same-sex spouse. So I'm luckier than Fawzia than millions of other people. But there are people who are not as lucky. And one of them is Sarjana Emmy in the story. Her family came here claiming political asylum when she was 4 years old. The asylum application was denied and turned into a final order of removal from this country. But a family lawyer filed for a work visa on their behalf, but never explained to them that the final order still existed. So Sarjana grew up in the U.S., went to school here, and upon high school graduation, she was rewarded with incarceration for that final order of removal that her family had received when she was only 4 years old. She spent 2 years in detention in Florida before she finally gave up and was deported to Bangladesh, a country she had not seen since she was 4 years old. This is before the president's deferred action announcements were in place. Another way in which enforcement occurs is for people who have committed various offenses in this country. We hear a lot about criminal aliens and who should be deported from the U.S., but how many of us actually question what that means? That label criminal alien has also been used against people in this picture like Zunaid, who committed a DUI in 2009, but he had been living and working in the U.S. for 15 years before that. He paid his fine and did his time like anyone else who commits a DUI. But in his case, he was picked up by immigration officials. And this despite the fact that he was married to a U.S. citizen. Zunaid was deported to India in 2013. So what does detained and deported means? Well, typically, once someone is deported or removed from the country, that means that person cannot immigrate to the U.S. for 10 years. There is a waiver, but hard to get without spending thousands of dollars on attorneys. If someone is deported, but re-enters without permission from the U.S. government, and if that person is caught, that person can be charged with a felony and barred from ever immigrating to the U.S. again. There's no waiver for that. It's the people like Zunaid, the people who re-enter without authorization to be with their families after they're deported, who make up currently the bulk of cases in federal criminal courts right now. So immigration enforcement isn't just about detention and deportation of undocumented immigrants. Enforcement also impacts lawful permanent residents as green card holders and even U.S. citizens. There are numerous cases of U.S. citizens who are accidentally deported every year, as well as green card holders who are also deported for new and old convictions for which they have done the time. We'll look at next some encounters that U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents undergo with the immigration system. So a really infamous one is border checkpoints that the CBP, the Customs and Border Protection, set up within 100 miles of the border to probe people or question them about their citizenship. This affects everyone who lives and works in the 100-mile zone, regardless of whether they have authorization to live or work here or not. This is a picture of Jose Antonio Vargas, who was also caught while he was visiting the southwest border. He's obviously not documented, but this happens. This sort of border checkpoint happens to both citizens and non-citizens as well. The next example is of lawful permanent residents or green card holders who are returning from a trip abroad, like abroad in another country, who are subjected to more stringent laws and requirements than U.S. citizens. If someone who has a green card stays out of the country for more than 6 months, they are presumed to actually lose their green card, and they're placed in proceedings to be deported from the country. If there are old crimes on their records, and even if they've done their time and gotten their conviction expunged, they're subject to removal proceedings as well from the country. Finally, E-Verify, that some of us might have heard of, is a U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services program. We briefly mentioned it. Basically, federal contractors in the U.S. are required to use this program to make sure that they don't hire undocumented immigrants. However, there are many issues with the program, and it continues to impact U.S. citizens, especially those who have naturalized, as in become U.S. citizens from being green card holders, and have failed to update their Social Security records. So oftentimes, someone who has not gone to Social Security office and gotten a new Social Security card that says they're authorized to work here would get a false positive hit on E-Verify and may lose their job as a result. So we'll take a deeper dive now into some of the programs and ways that the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, enforces immigration laws. First one is workplace raids. This involves, pretty much raiding a workplace of someone who's suspected of hiring undocumented immigrants and then prosecuting the employer as well as the employee for identity theft, using false Social Security numbers and other false documentation. Another program that ICE runs is Operation Streamline. This is a program to return or expedite the removal of people who are caught at the border and bring criminal charges against those people for illegal reentry, false claims of citizenship, even false documentation. And a conviction for illegal reentry would be a permanent bar to immigrating to the U.S. in this situation. So a lot of persons who are trying to reenter to be with their families are then given felony charges such as an illegal reentry and are allowed to never live in the country again. The next program we'll discuss is the Priority Enforcement Program, also known as PEP. This is a new program that continues some of the same old problems with the Secure Communities program that used to exist, where federal immigration enforcement and local law enforcement used to cooperate to basically get people who have been arrested to get them into the custody of ICE and then deport them. And the problem with this new PEP program is that it still continues the old and flawed system of entangling local law enforcement with federal immigration and undermining community policing. Another program that the USCIS runs nowadays is the Controlled Application Review and Resolution Program. It's a mouthful. It's called CARP in short. Basically, it's a USCIS program that excludes many applicants from Arab, Middle Eastern, Muslim, and South Asian communities by sort of delaying and denying their naturalization applications based on the same national security concerns that were done in Fawzia Din's husband's case. And the applications are delayed and denied for many years at a time. So these people are sort of considered too dangerous to become U.S. citizens, but too harmless to investigate, detain, and deport. So there are about 40,000 applicants right now for naturalization who are living in limbo, basically, and haven't been able to become U.S. citizens because of this profiling in effect. Next, the Fugitive Ops program. This is also an ICE program that seeks to locate and remove individuals who have gotten a final order of removal or deportation but have not left the country yet. These are the so-called fugitive aliens that you might hear about in the media, but they are targeted through this Fugitive Ops program. But the term fugitive alien just means that someone who has an order of deportation but hasn't left the country. Finally, the 287G program is a program that allows ICE to basically deputize or make state and local law enforcement police into immigration officials. Right now, the program is limited to just jails, where ICE continues to locate non-citizens in jail for removal. These are not all the programs that ICE and DHS carries out, but some of the most significant ones that impact our communities. Finally, let's talk about why immigration enforcement matters to AAPIs. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Sorry. So the first reason why it matters is the sky-high deportations that we have. Asian Americans comprise 1.3 million of the 11 million undocumented population in the country, and over 250,000 Asian Americans have been deported in the past 6 years. So that's a major problem because that's a devastating loss to so many families. In particular, immigration enforcement has a disproportionate impact on Southeast Asians from Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and so on. Immigrants from the Southeast Asian countries are 3 times more likely to be deported for prior old convictions compared with other immigrants. Over 13,000 individuals have received final orders of removal to Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam since 1998. They have little or no family connection to the countries they are being sent back to. Finally, immigrant youth. Approximately 1 in 10 undocumented youth are Asian American or Pacific Islander. Due to a number of barriers, including cultural, financial hurdles, and lack of clarity regarding the benefits of the program, far fewer Asian Americans have applied for deferred action for childhood arrivals. This is the President's executive relief program for immigrant youth than expected. So, out of the 1 out of 10, I believe only. Only 30% of the people who are eligible, or somewhere near the number of 30% eligible, have applied, as opposed to the many other people who are, this is a program that has been used predominantly by Latinos, and we have been slow in applying as the AAPI community, which causes problems for us because that means that about 70% of our immigrant youth who are eligible for this program have not applied and therefore are still subject to detention and deportation, which is troubling. As of this year, 1 out of 10 individuals currently facing removal proceedings are Asian American or Pacific Islander. Individuals from China, India, Bangladesh, and Nepal are among the top 10 nationalities for whom deportation orders are being sought in immigration court right now. Only a very small number of these filings in immigration court seek to remove these people on the basis of any alleged criminal activity, and most of these cases involve overstaying a visa. And finally, I want to touch on this small thing about this program called NCIS, which was in 2002 and 2003, post 9/11, almost 14,000 Arabs and Muslims were deported, including many South Asians, who were detained and deported under the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, primarily for immigration violations such as overstaying a visa. While the program is no longer in place and was ended in 2011, individuals from these countries continue to face negative immigration repercussions, and these families continue to be separated, and DHS continues to use the data that was gathered from this program. We will now take questions, and I think Anthony can facilitate that.
Yes, Purna, thank you very much. Everyone, we're now going to begin the Q&A session of our webinar. On your GoToWebinar program screen, you'll see a box for questions. If you have a question, simply type it in there and hit enter, and we'll be able to receive it.
That's fine.
Okay, so our first question, do people in deportation proceedings have a right to an attorney paid for by the government?
That's a great question, actually. So when you go to criminal court, in criminal court, you have a right to an attorney paid for by the government. But immigration is not considered a punitive system, even though in many respects it is a punitive system. However, people who are facing deportation are not actually, though they do not have a right to an attorney paid for by the government. They have a right to an attorney that they can pay for by themselves. So that is one of the things that we have to change about the system. Sure.
Okay, and we have another question. What are the major differences between PEP and Secure Communities programs?
It's a great question too. The one of the major differences between PEP and Secure Communities is Secure Communities used to basically be anytime anybody was arrested by local law enforcement or police, their fingerprints would be sent to ICE and FBI automatically, and ICE would then put a deportation, sort of a detainer hold on that person and pick them up for removal. And this is before that individual even had any sort of conviction. The new priority enforcement program is supposed to be a post-conviction program. It's supposed to only get into effect when somebody has not only been arrested, but arrested and convicted and sentenced. So that person has to be picked up after they're convicted by the criminal justice system. So that's the major difference between PEP and Secure Communities in that respect. PEP also is supposed to limit the kinds of so-called criminals and people who are supposed to be picked up by the program, but it's still unclear who they're going to limit their sort of deportation detainers for in this case. Oh, this is fine. I can leave that.
Okay, so we have another question coming in. How do most AAPIs end up out of status?
That is also, I think a great question. I think in a lot of cases it differs in different communities. A lot of people come here on a tourist visa, they become students, and then they're unable to get a job or get an employment sponsor, and they fall out of status that way. People also just overstay their visas because they have family here, and it takes so long to immigrate legally that people just stay and wait for their family petitions to then come up and become basically the visa backlog to reach them. So that's one way. Another way is like people who are on employment visas, like the H-1B visa. If they lose their job and they don't leave the country within a very limited amount of time, I think it's 10 days actually, then they start overstaying their status as well. So those are just some ways in which people sort of lose their status or fall out of status.
Okay, excellent. Our next question: why do you think that Asian youth are not coming out to take care or to take advantage of the DACA relief, and what do you suggest to change that fear of coming out?
I think one of the reasons is that our people, or Asian Americans at least, don't know the benefits of the program. I mean, there's the stigma and cultural barrier aside. I mean, we don't talk openly about being undocumented in our communities, especially Asian American communities. And then when we do have these free sort of community centers or free legal support being provided by many organizations, our Asian Americans don't really believe in going collectively to those services. Our people want lawyers and they want to pay for those lawyers. So it becomes convoluted where there's just not enough, first of all, information or advocacy that's reaching those communities. If it's reaching those communities, they don't know the benefits of it. And if they do know the benefits of it, they're probably also holding out for something that's more tangible and that's like permanent as opposed to temporary. And the answer to this is to like just continue being encouraging undocumented young people who are API who have received DACA to talk about how this has benefited them and to tell their families and their communities to apply for this program. And it also is about having us be ambassadors as well to talk about the benefits of this program and any other executive relief programs as well.
Okay, our next question, is there any reliable data showing what is the racial makeup of the immigrant detainee population?
Sure. I mean, at this current time, we have about 28,000 people who are in immigration detention centers. There's data released every year by ICE on their website. I don't have it in front of me. Most people who are detained are from Mexico or Central America. So that's good. I think the vast majority of people are from those countries. But I would need to look further into ICE's data to actually give you the real numbers. Okay, sure.
Okay, so our next question, could you tell us a bit more about the E-Verify system and how it is implemented? Are individuals with so-called offenses detected while going through customs and immigration?
So the E-Verify system is it's not mandatory right now in many states, unless you're from like Texas, right? Or you work for the federal government. What it is basically is a tool for the employer to check if you're authorized to work in the U.S. So you give your employer your data, and they would pretty much input the data, and they'll see if you're authorized to work. So that's just how it works. And the false positives happen when an employer is I'm sorry. When an employer checks on your status and you haven't updated your social security number from being a lawful permanent resident to being a U.S. citizen, it impacts Asian Americans a lot more because many of our people are immigrant. They immigrated here. I think 78% of adult Asian Americans are foreign born. That's a huge number. That's more than any other group. And it impacts us because if we don't update our records with the Social Security Administration, we get false positives all the time because they can't actually, because the system E-Verify tells them that this person is a green card holder, but the person is actually a U.S. citizen. So there's a disconnect and there's a false mess that comes up. This is not something that happens through customs and immigration. Like in that sense, it's more of a system through your employers. Yeah. Other questions?
Yes, let's see. There are more questions.
Sure.
So our next question, at the state level, what can we do to support undocumented immigrants?
That's great. So there's many things we can do. At AAJC, we don't do a lot of state level advocacy since we do a lot of federal policy work, but we do try to support our community partners in doing state level work in terms of community education, like this webinar, as well as information that we can give them. There's a lot of good legislation coming out in different states, such as California, to either there's Prop 47, which was to reduce felony to misdemeanors. There was the Trust Act, which was to end all cooperation between local police and immigration enforcement officials federally. So there's a lot of opportunity to get involved on the state level with a lot of creative ideas that different states have had in the past few years. So you can reach out to us and we can connect you with our partners or affiliates who are doing this work, as well as do DACA and DAPA outreach, I guess.
Okay.
I don't know. Are there any other questions?
Hold on, let's see.
Okay. Sure. Okay.
Okay, so our next question. After last year's announcement from President Obama, Janet Napolitano and John Morton memos are no longer available. Is there another policy or policies that the community can use to organize a public campaign?
Sure. I mean, there's two enforcement memos that are out the Morton memo no longer exists, but there's the priority enforcement program that I mentioned briefly that some of our affiliates are organizing against or trying to get more information on right now. There's also a new enforcement memo that's out. It's a Johnson memo. It should be available on DHS's site, which talks about the people who should be a priority for removal and deportation from the country. And the list involves a lot of people who should not be on the list as well. So that's definitely something that could be we can organize against, and we should try to limit the number of people who are targeted for removal. So look up that memo, and if you need more information on it, we can also email you if you email one of us. Well, I don't know the difference. You know? Okay. I can.
Okay, so our next question. Can you talk about the enforcement programs that involve cooperation with state and local law enforcement? Do state and city policies that decouple immigration from law enforcement actually protect their residents from programs like 287G?
Is this an effective strategy?
And is this an effective strategy to mitigate the impact of such programs?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the most winning campaigns that happened in the past few years is the Trust Act in California, which was basically banning the cooperation with immigration officials, federally, in terms of, and just limiting it to severe crimes and limiting it to just those issues. I think that had an impact where deportation numbers were actually down, and I said their deportation numbers were down because of the Trust Act and because because different jurisdictions were not giving them, not putting detainers on people or not complying with those requests to detain people. So I think those sorts of programs have helped. I think the Trust Act has helped immensely in trying to get us away from mass deportation. There are still programs that are in place, like the PEP program. There's also ICE access programs that exist in jails and prisons, like what somebody's called CAP. It's the Criminal Alien Program. We can look it up. It's basically the main program through which ICE continues to sort of get information about non-citizens who are in jails and prisons, and then put detainers on them, and then deport them from the country. So that continues to exist. But decoupling state and local cooperation has tremendously helped. And the one issue with that is, of course, then there's more visible enforcement in California, in communities that are rebelling, and that's also part of the problem. That's why people like our affiliates at ALC are fighting back. Yeah, go ahead.
So, okay, our next question. Can you tell us more about how CAARP, C-A-A-R-P, works?
Yeah, sure. So CARP, if people remember, is the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services program that disproportionately impacts Muslims and South Asian and Arab American populations in the U.S. It's not just for naturalization, although the reports are for naturalization right now that we have seen, but it impacts anytime someone applies for a green card or even asylum or naturalization. What happens is that if they are from one of the countries that are supposedly suspect, or like one of those countries that we have on our that we think is a national security sort of problem for the U.S., those applications are pretty much put on hold indefinitely, sometimes actually, until somebody sues. So that's all we sort of know about this program. There's litigation that is pending from the ACLU. It's called the Muhana complaint. I can send information about that out. That's still litigation that's pending by suing USCIS on this because it's racial profiling in effect. So, I mean, we don't know that much more about it besides the fact that a lot of Muslims, South Asians, Arab Americans have their applications on hold for long periods of time after 9/11, and that has impacted the community in a huge way. Any other questions? Yeah.
Okay, yes. Our next question. Do you have the number or know where to look for data for AAPIs that are eligible for DACA or DAPA by state?
Sure. There's two reports out. There's one by the Migration Policy Institute that was out, I think, a couple years back. that has some data on APIs by state. There's also the Brookings Institute report as well. So Brookings and MPI. And if you email us, we can give you the links after this webinar.
Yeah, the individual who asked that question, we have your email. We'll go ahead and share those with you afterwards. Okay, are there any more questions?
I can answer that.
Oh, this one?
Yeah. The refugee question.
Okay, so the next question. Do refugees have a certificate that identifies them as a person who has been granted political asylum from the U.S. government? And must refugees carry this document around as proof of lawful residency in case of random checks?
So refugees, just like asylees, they get a document like a work permit pretty much that sort of shows which category they belong to. So the category they belong to would be, you would know that they're a refugee because of that. So that's the one sort of document they have when they come to the U.S. and they get. They don't have to carry it. Like, you have to carry your green cards, but it's always advisable to carry it just because. And then, from that one, work permit that they get, they can then go to the state DMV and get a license to drive and get a state ID and all those other things. So, there's access to having documentation from the state if they need to.
Okay, do we have any more questions before we wrap up?
And if anyone has questions, they can also follow up with any of us. Our contact is on the screen after the webinar. We'll be more than happy to answer your questions.
Yeah, you can see on the screen our contact information is there. Well, this concludes part one of our summer webinar series on immigration enforcement. We hope that you found the information shared today informative. It was a lot of information shared, so in the coming days we will share 4 fact sheets that accompany this webinar, and which cover topics such, well, they provide an overview of immigration enforcement and its impact on AAPI communities, takes a look at the different agencies involved in enforcement, gives an overview of the different immigration enforcement programs that were mentioned today, and we also have a glossary of common terms used in immigration enforcement. So we will also be sharing a short follow-up survey with you so you can tell us how we did. Please do share some feedback with us. And finally, remember to save the date for part 2 in our summer webinar series, which will be held on July 15th, 2015 at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. In part 2, we will delve more deeply into what sort of criminal convictions or crimes can make someone a target for deportation, take a look at the immigration detention system itself, and hear from members of the community who have been subject to detention and deportation in the past. And then in August, we will have part 3 of the summer webinar series, in which we'll look at detention and cooperation between federal law enforcement and local law enforcement issues. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope that you all have a great week.